Yeah.
Welcome everyone to today's educational seminar. It's our fellowship panel from Pipe Dream to Project in Action. This is where we bring in two supervisors, an Equal Justice Works and a Skadden Fellow to talk about how they came up with the project, how they talked to an agency about helping them apply for a fellowship, and then where they're now working on that project. So to get started, let's just go down the line. Let's start with our two fellows, Emily and Joey. Introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your project, and why you chose to pursue a fellowship in public interest law.
I'm Joey Carillo. I work for Legal Aid Chicago. Why I chose a public interest fellowship. So what really attracted me to the fellowship process was that it starts pretty early. And I liked the idea of sort of getting a head start on what I wanted to do after law school. A lot of the interviewing opportunities sort of happen after that fellowship process. So I was like, I can get a first bite at the apple and try it out. It's a lot of work. But I really wasn't seeing the kind of work that I wanted to do in Chicago. And so I really thought about, this being a great opportunity to start something that was really a huge need. Doing something I was passionate about and starting my career at an organization that I interned at and really enjoyed. So I would say that's
what's your project specifically?
So, the project specifically, I work with LGBTQ survivors of domestic violence in order protection, litigation, as well as family law matters, child custody, divorce, and some special education matters and name changes.
Emily?
Hi, I'm Emily Wilson. I'm at Equip for Equality, and I'm a Skadden Fellow there. I always wanted to do special education work and went to law school with that really in mind, and wanted to do public interest and really didn't know much about the legal world generally before going to law school. And thankfully just had a few people when I first started law school and told them what my interests were, who said oh, you should look into fellowships. And so that's what I did, and really realized it was a great opportunity to develop a new project, something that an organization really needed, and a way to get my foot in the door in the public interest world that really made sense to me. And so my project is focused on serving students with disabilities that are transition age, so they're 14 and a half to 22. Under the law, students are supposed to get services to help prepare them for life after school, helping them get a job or live independently. Whatever kind of that's going to look like for them, school should be helping them get there. And a lot of times we realize that wasn't happening for students. So my project focuses on making sure that that changes, right? And that students get access to those services.
Great. And then Benna and Olga, tell us about yourself and describe your agency and why a fellowship works with your agency. What are you looking for in a fellowship?
Sure. So hi, everybody. My name is Benna Crawford, and I'm with Legal Aid Chicago. And our agency provides representation in all areas of civil legal services to residents of Cook County who are living in poverty. The group that I am a part of, the Children and Families Practice Group, we represent survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault in family law litigation. We also represent youth in care in their special education, as well as school discipline matters. And then we have a team of attorneys who represent parents and non-parent caregivers who are involved with DCFS or the Child Protection Division of the Circuit Court. And fellowships generally, but specifically Joey's, what I loved about it was the way it layered on top of the work that we were already doing. So it didn't require us to have additional, we were able to support that project. We had this subject matter expertise, but he was able to identify a real big gap in the clients that we were serving or not serving well, and expand and improve upon the quality of services that we were able to provide.
And then Olga.
So I'm Olga Pribyl. I'm the Vice President of Special Education Clinic and Pro Bono at Equip for Equality. And Equip for Equality is a disability rights organization for the state of Illinois. Every state has one of us. We're federally funded. And we do from zero to cradle to grave, I call it, for issues for people with disabilities. So, and we have 3 legal teams, the special education clinic, and then we have the civil rights team, which does adult issues, and then we have an abuse and investigation unit. And what I liked about Emily's project was similar to what Benna said, is like it's filling a gap where we don't have resources to really expand upon that area or to do outreach or to target that population that really needs services. And so while we have worked with transition age youth all along, we really didn't have anyone focused who could go out and do trainings, go out and do outreaches, prepare materials. Emily was lucky enough to work on, excuse me, legislation that impacted youth in the transition age group because of the pandemic. So all these things are resource intensive, and it's really great to have fellowships to do that.
So Joey, you did an Equal Justice Works Fellowship, and then Emily did a Skadden Fellowship. Can both of you tell us a little bit more about the fellowship in general, and what the process is, what the timeline usually is, and maybe even when you started thinking about applying?
Yes. So Equal Justice Works, their timeline, I think they, if I remember correctly, they recommend that you start the beginning of the summer of your going into your 3L year. And because you need time to sort of figure out like, you know, either an issue area or client population you want to focus on, or an agency, because there are many ways that you can kind of figure out and structure it. And so you need that time. So I think that's why they recommend starting a little bit earlier. And so that's what I ended up doing, is starting the summer going into my 3L year. And then you know, once you've kind of figured out an agency, you have to have the conversations with that agency to see if like they would be willing to accept your project. And then Legal Aid Chicago has their own separate actual fellowship process. There are other organizations that similarly do the same thing. So you'll definitely want to like figure that out, which is why starting the summer is great. And then actually filling out that application with that agency happens in about September. I think the application was due in September, and then they notified folks like shortly after that in October, and then interviews started November and went, I think, all the way through the spring until you ended up getting placed or interviewed and, you know, got your project funded by a sponsor. So that's sort of the general timeline.
Can you explain a little bit about the sponsorship process? And
Yeah.
like, you get approved, but then you're interviewing with sponsors. So what's that like?
Yeah, so so the first part of it is you are basically they want to they like your project and they choose it to go through the interview process with sponsors. And so then you just interview with a bunch of sponsors. I ended up only having one interview, but I think people sometimes have several because there may be sponsors that pick other projects. And so then you'll do, you know, a couple of waves of interviews and that like actual like your project is not only picked by EJW, but then funded. And then that's when sort of it all, because it's kind of like a 2-step process.
And then Emily, what's the Skadden side of all that? How's that process going?
Yeah, so there are a lot of similarities and kind of similar time frame. So similarly, you want to start thinking about what your project is and start thinking about potential host organizations. So sometimes, you know, in my case, it ended up being an organization that I had interned with that I ended up pursuing, getting a fellowship with them. Thankfully it worked out. But that's not always the case. Sometimes it's organizations that you just are aware of, or you find out that they're looking for a fellow. Some organizations will post kind of actual positions or fellowship projects that they're looking for somebody to take on. So you want to kind of be on the lookout for those opportunities. But it was, I think, around June that I reached out to EFE and said, hey, any chance you still are looking for fellows? And they had a process that we went through and applied with them internally to figure out if I was going to be a fellowship candidate for the organization. And then we worked together to develop the application materials. You really want to make sure that your host organization is involved in that process. A lot of organizations kind of have their own internal system, but especially if you're working with an organization that's newer to the fellowship process, the more that they're involved, right, you're going to be there. So you want to make sure that they're a part of this and it's going to be a project that's going to work for both of you. And so that process was in September, and I think it was the end of August, early September when you're submitting your application for the Skadden Fellowship. And then the process from there works a little bit differently. So with Skadden, you'll find out if you're selected for an interview. And then the interview process is pretty quick. You're only interviewing with Skadden. So it'll be somebody from the Skadden Foundation, and typically somebody else from the firm office that you're at. So I interviewed in DC. So it was a partner at the DC office who was in my interview with me. And so you only do the interview once, and then you find out if they're going to put your application up with their board. And then there's a second round of the final selections. But you find out in October, and you'll find out before that process. They make it kind of rolling. So you find out about Skadden before you find out about equal justice work. So if you had applied for both, you could take back that application. So they kind of work together to make sure that that happens.
Great. And then on the supervisor side, so any extra information about that process that students should know? I think for both of your organizations, you've had Equal Justice Works and Skadden Fellowships. So from an agency perspective, maybe the differences that you see and things that folks should be considering when they're starting the process of thinking about a fellowship?
So, they're both great fellowships. They fully fund the fellows for 2 years. You get to create your projects. I think the difference between Skadden and Equal Justice Works, they kind of look for different, I think Benna might have a different opinion. They look for different types of people maybe. Skadden traditionally has been like a top tier law school, like from the top 14, although I think that's changing a little bit. And, like Emily came from William and Mary, but if you look on their website, they have a lot of Harvard, Yale, NYU. So it's, so that's something that we take into consideration when we put up our candidates for Skadden's. Equal Justice Works is funded by a ton of organizations and a ton of law firms, foundations, so they get people to fund it. And Chicago has quite a few funders or law firms that fund it or foundations. And they're more interested, I think, in just kind of the project and the person's background, like what you bring to the table. So anyway, hopefully that's helpful. And I think with Equal Justice Works, they take more, they're both national fellowships, and so they're limited, but I think there's more EJWs than Skaddens, but they're still, it's highly competitive. So it's good to figure out what you want to do and probably try to work with your proposed host organization, intern with them, because I think that probably makes for a stronger application.
And Olga, does Equip for Equality have like a set timeline when they want to hear from fellows or a cutoff?
So we, it changes every year a little bit, but usually we tell people, we got information from folks in June this year. We made our decision this week.
Yeah, and for Legal Aid Chicago, we post, as I think Emily and Joey both mentioned, and maybe it's the same at Equip, on our website with our job postings. We post when we're seeking applications for fellows, and our application period, maybe it's a little later than Equip's, just closed last Friday. So all applications were due last Friday. And I think, so for the internal process, at least, as Olga mentioned, one thing that works really, I think, raises your application internally for the agency review is, have you interned? How much do you know about the organization? And how much, what experience have you had with the organization historically can elevate your application, although doesn't necessarily. We've sponsored fellows who didn't work at Legal Aid Chicago before as well.
And then any other thoughts from your perspective on the differences between the two fellowships, or anything else we haven't mentioned that we
I think
should just
Olga, I would agree with what you said about the difference.
And like Legal Aid Chicago and Equip for Equality are two large organizations that have a really robust like fellowship process. There are a lot of other agencies that aren't this early in the timeline. So like both are, don't be thinking, oh wow, this is way too, like I'm done already and I have no chance for fellowships. You should check with the agency that you're with, if they're still like what their process is. There are a lot of agencies that don't even really start thinking about it until later August, September, because and the deadline for both of them is more mid-September, late September.
I think Skadden's earlier
Yeah.
now.
Yeah,
Skadden has an earlier process now because they decide earlier.
Mine was in mid-September.
Yeah, I think Skadden is like the week before, a week or 2 weeks
Okay.
before equal justice works. It's pretty close. But it's a little bit earlier to get that application in.
The Skadden application is not as involved as the EJW application. So it's, I think, 3 short questions, but you better get a lot in there. So you want to sell yourself. And the EJW, I think it's, I don't know, like
Pages and
10
pages and
pages,
pages.
It's
12
very
pages.
long.
It's long, but there's like post-organization stuff on there, and so they get a lot of information. So are there any 3Ls here or rising 3Ls who are interested in the fellowship process? Have you talked to like where you're interning about it already? Probably should do that. So I'll give you some motherly advice, because it really is, like you want a strong application, so you should work on it sooner than later. And then if your host organization doesn't put people up, you want to start searching for other organizations that might be in a subject area that you're interested in. So we're approached by outside people who haven't interned with us. And I think like Benna said, I think we put up 2 people in my 15 years at Equip who haven't interned with us.
Then what about you with Legal Aid Chicago? How many, what would you say the percentage from internal and external?
In terms of who we actually put up as fellowship. I mean, I would expect that it's very, very small and that the applications that rise to the top are applicants with whom we have previously worked. We know the quality of their work. We know that they know what we do. And so it's a small percentage. I just don't want anyone to feel like, well, if the organizations with which I interned are not taking, the door is not closed, it's still worth it. But certainly it's a very small percentage.
Because there's plenty of organizations who take fellows outside of their internship program. And last year we put up someone who was outside of our internship program. So yeah, you should definitely, pursue options and but if you have an opportunity to work with an organization. So for the rising 2L, it's probably better advice for you. If there's an organization that you're interested in, you probably want to try to intern with during the school year or next summer, so that you can get your foot in the door and they can get to know you. But the sooner the better, because even if you start like next summer, depending on when they make their decisions, they might know people already or have people in mind. So,
And I was involved in a fellowship process as a supervisor at a smaller organization, and we actually had the potential fellow intern with us as they were getting the application together, as a way to meet everyone, make sure that this was the right fit, because it's also, you're kind of like in the process to work at an agency is actually what it is. So you want to make sure that it's a good fit and you are not gonna be stuck there for 2 years and not like it.
stuck. I like the way you say that. Come on, Brett. Happily to be at that organization.
You want to make sure that you're
Yeah,
happily there,
yeah,
and then it's especially when it's an outside agency, But let's talk about thinking about that idea, brainstorming. Let's go back, Joey. I think for you it was 2 years, and Emily it might be 3, if I'm right, or is it 2?
It was 3 years ago. Yeah.
When you're starting to think about what you want the project to be, how did you come up with this? How did you approach the agency with this idea? Did you approach multiple agencies with the idea? Talk a little bit about that. Emily, maybe you go first.
Yeah, so my process, I had interned, like I said, at Equip. And so when I decided that I wanted to try and pursue a fellowship with Equip, I had come up with kind of a list of different potential topics and thinking about my internship experience and also my personal experiences as to kind of what needs I saw, and made kind of a short list of what those could be, right? And thinking about what are some things that I saw, but recognizing the fact that I was there for 2 months, right? So how much of that is to the larger need of the organization? You know, I have a limited knowledge, and then was able to take that and have a conversation with staff at Equip about, okay, so these are some of the things that I'm thinking, what do you think will work? And it was really a project that was developed together, which I really appreciated, and it made me feel a lot more secure in the project too, of just knowing like, okay, not only is this something that I'm really interested in and a need that I'm seeing, but it's something that the organization overall is seeing, and there's kind of a developed need there. And so that was really the tack that I took. And I will say, you know, before kind of all of that started happening, just to backtrack a little bit, of looking at different host organizations, because it is kind of a scary thing. And especially if you know, Equip has a really strong internship program and a lot of people who want to end up there long-term, which is great. But it also means that as an intern, you're looking like, oh, this could not work. I could not be the fellow. And so thinking about some of those other organizations, and both, I know Equal Justice Works has this too, but Skadden and the website has a lot of information about past fellows, organizations that people have done fellowships at, the type of projects that they've done, and you can reach out to some people and get some information about those. But just there are a lot of ways to figure out what host organizations are out there. Both EJW and Skadden are open to new host organizations, but sometimes it can be helpful just to find people who have sponsored in the past and get more information about the types of projects, and just really get an idea of kind of what's out there, what's been done, and how that might, inform what you want to do moving forward.
Joy?
For me, I had only interned at like 2 different agencies. And so I was like, all right, well, I'm gonna start there. And the other agency, I kind of knew that I wanted to do either something that I was familiar with in terms of practically what I interned in, which was either going to be family or immigration. And I, was kind of like passionate about LGBTQ stuff. And the one organization already had an LGBTQ project. That's the project that I interned with. And so I was like, I wonder how I could bring that perspective and that work to Legal Aid Chicago, where I wasn't seeing it as much. And so I had interned several semesters at Legal Aid and had like made a lot of relationships with different attorneys that worked there, different supervisors. And I just really like put the feelers out there of like, do you think that the agency would be open to something like this? Do you think this is something that could work within this like practice group if I were to do it within family law? What are the kinds of things that you would want to see? And had a couple of conversations with different attorneys there and got really great feedback about like the direction that they saw the agency going in. And at the time, I think, and we still are going through this DEI process and trying to serve reach other kinds of underserved communities, and as an organization, educating ourselves about different intersectional, just issues. And so it felt like the right time. And then I remember scheduling a call with Benna, and her and I had a conversation. So I think prior to us talking about the fellowship, I don't think we worked maybe a little bit, but I was like, I don't know Benna as well. And she's the director. So I was like, all right, I'll schedule a call. And then we had a conversation, and it just so happened that like, I was like, hey, I have this idea. I don't know if you'd be open to like an LGBT project. And she's like, actually, I'd love that. And it was like, just like an aligning of like, I think the stars align with sort of what, I think what you wanted to do, what I wanted to do, and I liked the organization a lot. And then, yeah, and the other thing I will say is, don't be afraid to reach out to your like career advisors. I went to Kent, so if there's anybody that goes to Kent that has not connected with Michelle, please do. Michelle Vodnik was super instrumental in like the actual like creation and writing of the project, because she's helped a lot of fellows out in the past. So she worked really directly with me on a lot of things. I had a lot of help, you know, from Benna and from other people at Legal Aid Chicago to sort of what to put in the application and like how to create it and what are the things that are important. And another thing is we also worked with a partner agency that we were sort of one of the agencies we were going to target to kind of learn more about the legal needs. And so that informed the application. And I think that that was probably, you know, I know that was something that they sort of say will strengthen applications, proof that you've done the work and you've been reaching out to the organizations and that you can build those relationships, because that's really important to a lot of the process too. So definitely, you know, lean on those and try to incorporate that when you're creating the project.
And Benna and Olga, what advice do you have for students who are brainstorming ideas, thinking about approaching an agency? How should they go about trying to develop a project?
Well, I think it should be something that you're passionate about, because if you're not passionate about it, it's not going to show up in the interview process or your application. So it's good to make sure that it aligns with the host organization, but it should really be something that you take ownership of. And you might have lots of ideas or lots of areas of interest, which is great, but it should focus on something that you want to do, because it's really your 2-year project.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the strongest candidates that I've seen are candidates like Joey, who come to us and say, this is what I'm passionate about. This is what I've identified. Does that fit with you? Or help me brainstorm how this, so that there is this element of, you know, Joey had done the work already. He had already laid the groundwork. He had shown that he was really both knowledgeable and committed to this, and then came to us to talk about, well, and how does that fit in with, and I think, at least for me, seeing a candidate like Joey, that's really what makes him rise to the top, is just the groundwork and the research and the time that he had put into. But we all the time, we regularly have people reach out to us to brainstorm ideas and to figure out, and in some ways it is also you figuring out, is this agency the right fit for my project, right? If you have something that you're passionate about, I think as Brent said, although you would never be stuck at Chicago or but you know, not every agency is going to be the right fit for the project that you are passionate about. And so in some ways, those conversations are a really good way for you to also find out more information about the agencies and whether they're the ones that you want to work with.
And what's your application like for potential fellows, just for the first step?
It's just a cover letter for Legal Aid Chicago. Cover letter. It's like a job application. So cover letter, resume, writing sample, transcript, and some references. So the same as if you were applying. So it's really, the cover letter is your opportunity to show us what, if anything, about, you know, your fellowship that you've already developed. Are you just interested in a fellowship generally and you'd like us to help you come up with one? We leave it open, so you can either propose an idea or just say you're interested.
And we don't have as formal of a process, so but it's just, you know, getting a resume, transcript, and project ideas, and a little bit about your background information, what connects you to the project. So I guess it's all except we don't ask for a writing sample or references. I guess we should, but we don't. So.
And then I'll ask this question and then open it up for everyone here or over Zoom to ask questions too. But we mentioned this briefly, but let's talk a little bit more about the application for Equal Justice First in Skadden. So Joey, if you can remember, what is the application like the questions, and I just remember they're so long, but.
Yeah, no, I do remember this. I spent a long time working on it. So like the part one is the description of the project, and they want you to have done some research on like the need. And so they want you to talk about like, what is the need that you're filling and how are you doing that? And the challenge with all of this is there's character limits. So like you have to do it to like be compelling, like in a really concise way. So that research part of it, of like demonstrating that this is a legal need that exists in the world that you want to solve. They want to see your goals and your objectives for those goals. How are you going to achieve that? And they want you to present a timeline. You're like, literally, you're 2 years, like for 6 months, I'm doing X, Y, and Z. next 6 months, I'm doing X, Y, and Z, like putting that plan in place to show that like, you know what this is gonna look like and you've thought about that. And like worked with your host org to make sure that it is in line with sort of what's possible. And then they also want to know about your experience working with pro bonos. Because I think one of the big, parts of like law firms or companies that are sponsoring projects often like to get involved. And so they want to know, like, have you worked with pro bono attorneys before in the work that you've done? And so you can talk about that. And then the last part about it is like talking about just like, why do you want to do this work? Why are you passionate about these issues? And just like a little bit about your personal story. And then the other part is for pretty much your, whoever is going to be your supervisor and then your host organization, just general questions about like their process, their organization, how do they support fellows, both during the fellowship and after the fellowship, all that kind of stuff.
And this is something like you draft, but it's a working document with you and your agency helping,
Yes. Exactly, yes. I did the initial draft of it and then sent it off. I know Benna put comments on it. Legal Aid Chicago has actually a committee of people that will like leave comments and work with you. And then my career advisor, Michelle at Chicago Kent, she also read it, gave some feedbacks and edits. And so I'm pretty sure I had like 15 versions of it by the time it was done.
It's a good experience
Yeah.
as a law student to have your work edited by a team of, 8 or 9 people. It's a really humbling experience.
Oh, yeah.
Emily, what about from Skadden and Equip?
Yeah, so I think it was mentioned a little bit earlier, but Skadden's
And did
application
you
is
do both? Sorry.
I did.
You did, okay,
I did
so
a
maybe
part.
talk a little bit about that too.
Yeah, so the Skadden application is much shorter. Unfortunately, I cannot remember what the questions are specifically, but it's along the lines of Skadden wants to know, like, why this project? Right? Why does it matter? Why do you care about it? Why you? Why are you the person to do it? And then why this organization? Why are they the people who should be hosting you? And then ultimately, who are you going to be serving? Are kind of the big ticket things that they want to make sure that you are getting across. Similarly, it has very, very short word limits. Space goes up very quickly. My biggest tip for people is I did apply for both Equal Justice Works and Skadden, but I would say, even if you are not going to do Equal Justice Works, I would take a look at their application, because one of the most helpful things was that I did that first. Because Equal Justice Works has such a detailed application, and it really makes you think about, okay, well, what are my goals? How is this actually going to function? And kind of, at least for me, thinking through a lot of that logistical information really helped me kind of dig deeper and be able to distill what I wanted to share in the more limited word count on the Skadden application. And again, it was a committee of people who were looking at it and editing it and refining it. And it was, definitely a humbling experience, but a great one. Another thing that was really helpful for me, my career services office was very kind, but was not experienced in fellowships whatsoever. They were really trying, when I was in law school, trying to get better at that and trying to really expand their knowledge, but that foundation was just not there when I was there. But honestly, it was actually kind of helpful that they didn't really know, because it gave a very different perspective, and I could kind of use that to help inform. Because one of the things that, I think this came across with interview tips that we've gotten as well, is that you want to make sure that your project and what you're pitching is something that anybody can understand, right? Even if they're not, we get really bogged down in the public interest world, and especially special education and all of the acronyms and the different things that we're talking about, but being able to explain it to somebody who's not in that world. And that was really the resource that my career services office was people who were not in this world, who I was really able to explain things to. And when they looked at my application, they were looking at it through a different lens. So it just added an extra layer of kind of a different perspective, as well as all of that is from Equip.
And then how was doing both? Any comments from that?
Yeah, so it was a bit stressful. Like I said, it was helpful to do the Equal Justice Works application first. And they are structured because Skadden and Equal Justice Works recognize that a lot of people apply for both. So it wasn't something that was, at least explained to me as a negative that I had applied for both. It does ask you on the applications if you've applied for any other fellowships. I think on both of them it asks that. So you do have to say that. But then Skadden, I found out about that I got Skadden before Equal Justice Works announced if you made it to the next round. So the timing works out so that you know, and then you just notify them that you no longer need to apply.
Okay, so questions from folks in the room or on chat? One on chat?
Yeah, the question is, if an organization you are interested in working for has an open staff attorney position available, what are the pros and cons of applying to that position straight out of law school versus applying for a fellowship with them first?
I've actually thought about this a lot, because I had this discussion with a staff attorney who was a new staff attorney when I was interning, who talked with me about like the pros and cons of it. Because initially, I actually didn't think I wanted to do a fellowship. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, no, I actually do think this would be a good fit. So here's what I would say. From my perspective, I feel like the difference is that like, if this organization is doing the kind of work that you really want to continue to do, and you're happy with just continuing to do that staff attorney work, you're going to get assigned cases, you're going to be assigned the work, and you're going, to whatever degree and agency that you have at the organization, it's the same as every other staff attorney. Whereas I feel like a fellow, on the con of that is like, it was a lot of work to do and to propose this project. And yeah, it would have kind of sucked if I would have done the work and like not have gotten the fellowship. And then I would have just applied for like a staff attorney position. But not all organizations have that option. So number one, that doesn't exist everywhere. But number two, I do think though, the biggest pro of it is that I feel like I have a lot of flexibility because as an attorney, a lot of the attorney positions, at least at Legal Aid Chicago, are like sometimes tied to grants. And so there's restrictions on the kinds of cases they want to take. And so you may not have as much agency. Whereas like now, like for example, there was this Title IX case that rolled through to our education law team. That wasn't something that I ever really envisioned as being a part of my project. And it was a part of the client population that I wanted to serve. And so we melded the two together. And like, I got this really great experience filing a Title IX case that I probably would not have had the opportunity had I just been a family law staff attorney with the organization. And so like, I think it allows me to get a very broad set of experiences and to specialize in a way that you may not be able to do as a staff attorney. So that's just sort of and again, I think it changes by the organization, but like, I really love the fact that like, I can see something and be like, oh, wow, there are some LGBTQ issues in this case. It's maybe a different area of the law. I'm not restricted by a grant. And I'm given, I think, very wide latitude, and I really appreciate that opportunity as a brand new attorney looking to learn and like hone my skills. Like, I think it's incredibly advantageous to kind of do that. So,
Other thoughts?
I mean, I think the short answer is, I don't think there's a downside to applying for both from the agency perspective. I think having applicants who have a demonstrated desire to work with our agency speaks highly of the applicant. And so it's pretty common that we have people, especially the EJW, we hire at Legal Aid Chicago, we hire a fall class of attorneys in addition to the EJW and Skadden Fellows, and the timelines don't line up in a way where you would be applying for them at the same time. But we do often have people who have applied for a fellowship with us to be funded through their law school, as well as applied for a staff attorney position. And if they get the fellowship, great, and we'll go that route first. Or they get so there's no downside from an agency perspective, at least mine, to applying for both.
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't have a whole lot more to say beyond what Joey said, but I will say, I think it just comes down to like, the fellowship gives you a space to go after that passion project or that need that you're seeing. And whereas if you're hired as a staff attorney, that's because they need a staff attorney position, not for your kind of project. And there might be space that you can make within that, bringing whatever you are personally bringing to the organization. I think one pro is just that you're not trying to figure out employment 2 years later.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's.
Yeah, I think fellowships, you really find out way ahead of any other job before the bar exam, I mean, it's usually like the spring that's the latest that you would find out is like April or May. But this is like your opportunity to like customize a job almost.
Yeah, and we don't have, like, Legal Aid Chicago, we don't have like a class of new attorneys every year, so I think it's just, figuring out if there is a staff attorney position open, that would probably be later on in the year when we know about it for someone who's just graduating. So apply for the fellowships and we try to keep our fellows. Once we get them, it's not always possible, but like Emily said, like then you're looking for different grants, or if someone leaves, or if we get funding from somewhere, then we try to keep folks on, and we have been able to do that in the past. So it's a great way to get your foot in the door and to see if you like the organization and want to stay there. And it's also a very prestigious thing to have on your resume that you were EJW or Skadden.
Other questions?
We have another one from the chat. Some EJWs and Skadden Fellowships are pretty competitive. Did you have a backup plan if you were not chosen, or is the application interview process early enough that if you weren't to get a fellowship, you would still have time to find a post-grad job?
Yes. I would say like Brent was saying, I think that's very true, that like you can find out a lot earlier than like most organizations are going to be hiring a new attorney anyway. Like I found out about I think I was very early, but there were other people who were also early. Like I knew in November of my 3L year that I had a position, and like I don't know anybody else that like had that super early. Like there's in terms of like outside of public interest. So yeah, like it is your chance to get the first bite at the apple and secure it early. And they do that purposefully so that because it is competitive. So if you don't get it, then you have time to sort of regroup and figure out what you want to do. And so like after you apply, you should be thinking about that though. Like you apply August, September, and then the reality that you may not get it. So you have time though, then the rest of the fall to figure out what you need to do in late fall or early spring for your backup plan. And so like, I mean, my backup plan was I was gonna just apply to the attorney class at the organization that I was applying to. And I was sort of like looking at other, like, I think I had signed up for like there was an interview day or something like that on campus, or I don't remember what it was, some kind of fair that I was going to go to sort of see the other opportunities and looking at the others, like Chicago-based agencies that I wanted to end up at if I didn't get it. So just like you should be thinking about that after you're done applying, then you can sort of think about your like backup plans.
And Skadden lets you know, like, definitively in November or whatever, but EJW, it's more of a rolling basis. So you were lucky that you found out in November, because we've had some people who found out in March. And then sometimes they try to get new sponsors, or if they really like an applicant, they try to get more sponsorships and things like that. So it could go on into March or April. And so that's just, be aware of that. It might not be November, but yeah, but most legal aid organizations, if you're committed to public interest and want to do public interest work, unless it's like Legal Aid Chicago, most organizations don't have a starting class. And so they'll be posting stuff probably closer to when you're graduating for positions, or in the spring that are open. So.
And I would even say
not really missing out.
Most public interest like jobs, a lot of times it's after you even get your bar results that you really are kind of applying for jobs. Like a lot of times, maybe it all depends. But I think a lot of times it's just what jobs are available, when they are, and when there's funding for it. I know Legal Aid Chicago has a fall class, so.
Right, it's just a little different.
It's different.
But I also think, if you don't get the EJW fellowship or the Skadden Fellowship, you have, if an organization has decided that they want to host you, we as an organization have already decided that you're phenomenal, and we've put a lot of time and effort into supporting your application, which means theoretically, when a position opens up, you're going to be elevated as a candidate in the eyes. Now, it's not a slam dunk guarantee that you'll get the job, but if there's an organization that you're really committed to, it's a great way to elevate yourself, even if you don't get the fellowship in that round.
Yeah, I agree.
Or even have a relationship with an agency that then helps you, maybe there isn't a job posting at a smaller agency, but there is, like, we've talked so many times about how this is such a close-knit community where a lot of people know each other, that like you can call Equip and say, I know that Emily applied for this job. We did a fellowship application. It didn't go through, but she's so great, so.
Yeah, I've gotten multiple, like when I have a job posting and then I get from all the legal aid folks, this person's great, that person's great. And it's like, okay. I felt like I had, what was years ago, maybe it's like too much in the past, but I had a job opening and it was like when Barack Obama's Senate seat was open, I felt like that's what it was. Everybody, I got emails from everybody saying this person's, and I'm like, okay, can't interview all these people, but anyway, so it is a small community.
So what promises were being made for that?
Nothing.
What did you get?
Nothing at all. That's when I hired Lamb. I don't know if you remember Lamb, but yeah.
Questions from well, let's talk a little bit about how the folks in this room and on Zoom who are working at agencies this summer, doing an internship, how can they use this experience to make connections, to start putting feelers out and start thinking about either making that relationship with the agency or how to start thinking about that idea that could be their project?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing, and kind of goes back to what we're talking about, the smaller community, right, is building those relationships and having conversations and just being open about, this is something that I'm really interested in and I'm passionate about, or I'm really interested in this work, and having, if it's, I know it's a little bit different now than when I interned, but like grabbing coffee, right, or a Zoom coffee now, or going to lunch with somebody and just saying, like, can I ask you about how you got into public interest? Or, what issues do you see? Or these are some things that I'm interested in. And just really trying to have those conversations. I think also having conversations with your fellow interns, right? And your classmates who are interning at other organizations and getting information about kind of what they're seeing. And just the more you can really talk about these things, I think it really builds those relationships and also gives you a better idea how to continue to have those conversations. And you're continually learning. I think the other thing is, I mentioned before that EJW and Skadden both have really robust websites with a lot of resources, is reach out to current or past fellows. That was a great resource for me. And I didn't talk to a single person or reach out to a single person that wasn't willing to talk to me. Or didn't seem like they wanted to talk to me. Everyone was really welcoming and really happy to talk about it because we're all excited about public interest. Like, this is what our passion is. And so we want to have those conversations and want to foster our emerging attorneys going into public interest. And I think it was a very scary thing for me to do that because it felt like I was imposing on people. But the more I had those conversations, the more I realized, people actually want to talk to me. This is actually going to be good. So that would be kind of my biggest recommendation.
Yeah, I think looking at the websites is key. Seeing what other projects were that have been accepted in the areas that you're interested in can help inform you. And also, like Skadden has certain projects that they won't fund. So it's good to go on their websites to know what they'll fund or what they won't fund. And I don't think EJW has the same restrictions, but Emily, what was it? Or maybe I talked to Amanda about it. They won't fund
adult, juvenile, or
No.
adult incarcerated projects.
So yeah, just good to think about that.
I think I'd also mention when you're interning at organizations, notice the holes, notice the connections that maybe people don't affirmatively articulate, but just as you're engaging with the work and you're hearing the attorneys work on their cases or be unable to accept cases, there's a lot of connections or holes that people just articulate and then move past because we're all just doing the work. And notice that, because that's where your project might live.
Yeah. Joey, any other thoughts from your internships?
No, I think all that's great. I will say it is a lot harder to build that relationship remotely, as I assume a lot of you are probably doing remote internships. Well, I had an interesting experience of like, I interned at Legal Aid in person, and then it ended up being remote for the final 1 or 2 that I did. And the experiences were vastly different, but for me, because I had the in-person one, like I feel like I did get that opportunity. Although, you know, still though, you can still you have to be intentional about it. And I think the same is true, like if you reach out to other attorneys in your host organizations and say, hey, can we just have like a 15-minute like coffee in the morning over Hangouts or over Zoom? I want to just, and I like, again, same thing, like I've never heard, anytime I've asked any attorney, even if I don't even work with them, if they work in another area of our practice group or of the agency, they're always willing to sit down and have that, even if it's over Zoom or Hangouts, because I think a lot of attorneys recognize that it's really, sometimes it can be really hard to get in to public interest without that like initial, you know, those relationships and without that direct pipeline sometimes. So I think everyone is happy to have that conversation and build those relationships. And like, if you're thinking about too, working at another organization, you should verbalize that, because like a lot of folks have said, they may have relationships with people who work there. So that's how I ended up getting an internship at NIJC. I wanted to work there and I asked around, and it was another attorney who had worked in a whole different practice group who sat down and chatted with me about her experience there. And she's like, oh, I actually know somebody who works on that team that you want to work on. I set up a call with her before I even applied and had a conversation. So like, that network is super important. And like verbalizing your intentions is really important, because you never know who at your organization knows of another organization that would be a great fit for you, or that has an open position like that. This is the time for you to do that.
Let's check for questions from the chat or in the room. So Emily and Joy, tell us a little bit more about the work that you're doing now with your fellowship, and then what you're thinking about beyond the 2 years. If you have any, I mean, Emily, you're close to it, no?
Yeah.
Not to put you on the spot with your supervisor in the room. So. What is the?
They're open to keep her. Got plans.
Their plans.
Yeah, so I am coming to the end of my fellowship. I started in August 2020. Like I said before, so I work with transition age youth for the most part, serving 14 and a half to 22 to focus on getting those services to get them ready for the next step. So that's representing at IEP meetings, to advocate for services to be added to the IEP, dispute resolution, so mediation or due process as regarding failure to do so for a long period of time. As Olga mentioned, I also had the opportunity to work on some of the legislation and that came through to provide additional services for students who were exited from special education during remote learning, because it meant that they missed out on really critical transition services. In particular, or kind of one of the things we think about with transition services is that community-based instructional piece, right? Teaching kids how to go to the grocery store, how to look for apartments in your neighborhood, how to work, right? What kind of vocational opportunities are out there, and that hands-on experience is really critical, especially for individuals with disabilities. And so there was legislation passed to add an additional year. So any student who was exited during that time frame could come back and come to school for the 2021-2022 school year. So I was really fortunate that I got the opportunity to work on that. I really appreciated that I've gotten to kind of really do a wide variety of that work. It's been a lot of, the beginning of my fellowship started with a lot of trainings and a lot of creation of materials, so that we really could develop more relationships and let people know that we were going to be doing this work. That was not something that I had really anticipated when I thought about developing my project, but it's something I'm incredibly thankful for, and I do think really made a difference. and being able to build those relationships and also just let parents know like, hey, this is a thing, right? This is something that your kid is supposed to get. And I was really, have been really, I feel very fortunate to have gotten the opportunity to do that and recognizing that, once those cases pile up, it's very hard to make time to do kind of that aspect of the work. And then Skadden is a little bit different than Equal Justice Works in reporting requirements. So not to speak for Equal Justice Works, but for Skadden, it means a lot more flexibility. So I was also not limited to just taking on projects or cases within my project area. I could be a little bit more expansive, which I really appreciated, and giving me the opportunity to do kind of some diverse casework and also look at ways that we didn't really think about, or at least in the creation of my project, I didn't think about how transition services really interplayed with different groups and different populations of students that we served. For example, I hadn't thought about how critical it was in the court-involved youth aspect. And that's something that we really were able to kind of explore and develop additional resources that weren't maybe what we think of traditionally as transition services. That was a really good opportunity. And then I think all of those experiences really build on figuring out what you want to do next, and realizing, I made me realize even more that this is the work that I want to do, right? But I also have other fellows that I'm in close communication with that it made them realize the opposite, right? They worked really hard for 2 years and they gave their all of their organization and they don't want to do this anymore. And that's okay, right? And it gives you the opportunity to figure that out. But I'm hoping to use all of what I've learned over the last 2 years to continue to do this work.
Joey?
Yeah, I'm approaching my second year now. I've really appreciated the amount of diversity in the kinds of work that I'm doing. And I will say too, yeah, EJW, the application process is really, and the reporting is annoying and very detailed too. But they offer the opportunity, I think they're transparent about this, that they're not micromanaging your work. And so if you have something that you feel fits well, even if you didn't identify that in the beginning, because I'm learning a lot as I'm doing this work and I'm saying oh wow, there's this other need out there that I maybe didn't necessarily think about, but I'm open to growing into. You can still do that too with EJW. They just you have those goals that you initially set, and you can, as long as you're working towards those goals. I purposefully wrote them very broad, knowing that I wanted to potentially explore things. And so that's been fine. I haven't had any issues there. And also the sponsors are they're just grateful to hear about anything. They're just wow, that sounds amazing. And they're not thinking but on your application, you wrote this. They're not thinking that at all. They're just grateful to be hearing about the great stories and the great things that you're doing, whether they're this type of case or that type of case. They're funding you and you as an individual, and also the general impact that you're having. So, and they're not gonna nickel and dime you on these things. So that was really nice. And I've really enjoyed I've gotten to I spent a lot of time just reading and learning really of questions that would come in. If it was an area that I didn't know anything about, I would go to the attorney that I know does do these kinds of things, collaborate with them on the advice, go back to the client. And it's been a really great learning experience for me. And Ben and I are in the process of prepping for my first contested hearing coming up. So that's exciting. And I've been going to court a lot, and getting the opportunity to get that oral advocacy experience has been a really good learning opportunity. So yeah, I've really enjoyed it. And in terms of after the fellowship, I would hope to continue to do the work that I'm doing, or whether it, as a staff attorney, hopefully, with the organization. I know a lot of people who literally just transitioned out of being fellows into staff attorneys for the organization. So probably will do something similar to that at the end of my fellowship. But I'm also thinking about trying to find ways to make the work more permanent. So my next year, I'm kind of be focused on that. like, is there something that we can find in terms of funding to try to make it so that I'm not the only person doing this work? And like expanding on some of the foundation that I think the project is building. So that's sort of what I'm going to be thinking about this next year.
Great. And then to close us out, let's just go down from Olga to Joey with just like any final piece of advice, whether it's related to fellowships or something that you wish that you had known in law school, or something else for law students, just to end on a high note.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know if it's a high note, it's a piece of advice, I think, for folks. So I think oftentimes I'm interviewing people for positions like internships. It's really important for you guys to look on the website you probably have, but to know the organization. And I can't tell you how many times I ask people, what's your, like, what do you see yourself doing in the future? Or what's your passion? Like, what kind of law do you want to practice when you graduate? And they don't tell me special ed. I'm not gonna have them as an intern because we do special ed, right? So I think it happens time and time again. So just be careful about that. Like, know the organization you're interviewing with. Cover letters too. People put wrong agency names on or wrong information. So just double check it, be careful about it. I also interviewed one person who was a great candidate, and I said, well, where do you see yourself? Like, she was out of state. Oh, I want to stay in Michigan. I'm in Illinois. I can't, like, you're not gonna help me. So just like stupid little things like that you think people would know about, but it happens all the time. So just a word of advice for you guys. So
I think my advice is, and it's much easier said than done, but try your best not to compare yourself to other people throughout this process. Everyone's journey looks very different, and that's okay. And it should. And it's very easy to kind of get in your head of like, well, everybody's already got a job, or like everyone's already done the fellowship thing, or they know. You don't know what their journey is, right? And they don't know what yours is, and it will work out. You put the work in and you talk to people and you do what you need to do, it's gonna work out. And just try to focus on what you are doing and what you wanna do and where you wanna end up, and kind of block out the rest of that. And then if you feel like you really want that support system, find other people who are doing this, right? The people in this room who want to do this work and are gonna have, similar journeys to you and can kind of commiserate when everybody seems to already have their big firm job and you're still panicking, right? And that's okay. And it, like I said, it works out, but just try your best not to stress too much about it.
So I think one thing I didn't do during law school, and I wish I had, is building relationships with people who are already doing the work that you want to do and who can serve as a mentor to you. I think Joey has perfectly articulated what I did not realize in law school, which is that people who are doing the work are more than happy to chat with you and to mentor you and to give you the benefit of what they've learned from doing the work and help you, and take advantage of that, because having a good mentor can really, it makes a big difference.
Yeah, I second all of that. I would say, to second Emily's comment, one thing that I think that one of the deans at Chicago gave me this piece of advice, gave everybody this piece of advice that I think is so true. Like, the biggest source of stress in law school is other law students. So everyone is going to stress you out. So I love the comment about not comparing yourself to other people, because again, it does look very different for a lot of folks. And so that I think is really, really important. And the other thing that I would say too is really, really do take the time to ask because as an intern, you sort of have this limited view of what the work looks like, but to just once you build those relationships and to be to talk to attorneys about all right, what are some of because sometimes you might tend to be oh, everything is roses and sunshine, but it's not always that. And so it's important to know that. And I'm not saying this because oh my God, I should have run for the hills. But I think that I know other people who started doing public interest work and they're not happy because they didn't see the reality as so know that you should be asking those questions. You should be asking the hard questions, getting a projects where you're I don't know what's going on, but I want to learn. And like giving yourself those opportunities, even when it feels uncomfortable, when you're feeling like I'm not qualified to do this, like do it and put yourself in the position, because you never know what's going to happen. But like, and then also to like get good habits about like your own mental health, your own work-life balance. I think that a lot of folks that are doing this work tend to like, they're so passionate about it that they forget about their other needs. And like, I just, even before law school, just had this habit that I had developed because I've always worked in nonprofit, of like, when you can turn off at 5, turn off at 5, because the work will take up as much space as you allow it to. And so get those habits now. When you're interning, stop when you're supposed to stop. And like, sometimes you will have to work after, but like that, develop those habits now so that when you start, you're in a much better position to have healthy boundaries to stay long-term. So.
Great. Well, thank you, Joey, Benna, Emily, and Olga for talking with us about fellowships.
Thank you.